Hi, welcome to the Interviews with the Hunting Masters, brought to you by the Sneak Tech Sneak Boot. And this week we got a special podcast we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about wind um, and thermals and how it's all in relation to landscape. And I reached out to Austin Dixon, and Austin is he's studying for his master's right now at University of Oklahoma in atmospheric science, and he's already received his bachelor's in meteorology from the University of Oklahoma. He's been hunting since he's 7 years old. He runs a blog called Hunt the Front. And he talks about hunting weather patterns and stuff like that. So we're going to talk about wind, weather, and how it all plays into deer hunting. What's going on, man?
Not much. How you doing, John?
I'm good. Just cramming in a couple of podcasts here. I'm going to be leaving to do a little hunting in South Dakota, chase whitetail and mule deer, or whatever looks better.
Yeah.
Whatever I can find that's bigger. So it's kind of one of my favorite spots to go hunting. I do a little guiding over there as well. I have some private ground that I lease out and run some hunts off of, and it's kind of a neat gig because the whitetail and the mule deer kind of occupy the same area. Yeah, it's a fun hunt, and I'm looking forward to it. The rut should be kicking in here pretty soon. So you're in Wisconsin right now. You're an Oklahoma boy, but you're living in Wisconsin to do your master's.
Yeah. I'm actually getting my master's at the UW-Madison in atmospheric science, and yeah, like you said, I got my bachelor's in meteorology in Oklahoma, and that's where I grew up. And I'm a diehard Sooner fan, always will be. But I got the opportunity to. Well, I should preface that by saying that growing up in Oklahoma led me to be a big severe weather person. I have a slight obsession with severe weather and tornadoes. It's not even slight, actually. But so there was this guy named Lee Orff here at UW-Madison, and he's been doing research on tornadoes using supercomputers.
Okay.
And he's been using supercomputers to actually simulate the tornadoes and try to study the ins and outs of these storms and figure out what we can do to better forecast them and help people better prepare for them. And I've been following his work for a few years, and when it came time to apply for graduate school, I thought, why not? I'll take a shot in the dark and see if he's, looking for people like me to work with him. And it actually worked out, and I got an offer from him a few months later to come work for him, and I was beyond ecstatic. Sweet. So that's what I'm here doing now.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, so you've been hunting since you were a little kid, like 7 years old or something like that, you said?
Yeah. So my dad and grandpa were lifelong hunters, and my grandpa pretty much took me out in the woods as soon as he could, as soon as the rest of my family was okay with it and they thought it was safe. But yeah, I started going along with him on hunts when I was 6 or 7, really young.
Yeah.
And then he actually he bought me a rifle when I was 8, I think, and I shot my first deer that year. And I pretty much rifle hunted all the way up until I was about 16 or 17. And then he started letting me use his bow, and so I started getting more into bow hunting. And I still go out for at least a weekend or two every year during the rifle season in Oklahoma. But I didn't bring any guns with me to Wisconsin, really, because I just don't like keeping guns out in the open. Back home we got safes and stuff, and
right.
So I wasn't super comfortable with having a couple of rifles in my closet. But yeah, so I just brought the bow to Wisconsin. But my grandpa passed away recently, and he actually.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
I appreciate it. He was a good guy, but he actually gave me his bow right before he passed away. And so one of my goals now is to get a buck in either this season or, sometime soon with his bow before I go ahead and buy my own.
That's pretty cool. That's awesome. Well, you're in a good state for it, man. Wisconsin's got a crap ton of deer.
Yeah.
If you probably haven't already figured that out.
Yeah,
I haven't been there in a long time, but I know
yeah.
it's a mecca for big bucks if you know where to look.
Yeah, that's one of the things, it's a long process when you're trying to choose where to go to graduate school, because it's all about who you're going to work with and, how that could possibly define your career and, whether or not you're going to like where you live. And it's just all these different decisions. But when I started visiting UW, and one of the main things I was excited about was coming here and, getting to hunt in Wisconsin, because it's like, I can't remember the statistics, but it's like Illinois and Wisconsin have some of the highest totals of Boone and Crockett bucks anywhere in the U.S. So it's like, heck yeah, I can't wait to get up there and do some of that.
Yeah, and it's like a religion over there in Wisconsin. Like, they take their hunting seriously, which is kind of cool. Like, you don't get some of the backlash that you do in some of the other states. Like, it's very well accepted, viewed by the mass majority of the people that live in Wisconsin, because they know it's like a holiday. Opening season, rifle season is like a holiday over there. Kids get out of school.
I haven't ran into anybody who was really an anti-hunter here yet. I've heard stories from some older guys who had some issues with antis, like way back in the day, like 20 years ago. But I haven't had any experience with that. And when I was meeting everybody in the graduate school here, I was kind of nervous to tell them that I was one of my main hobbies or interests was deer hunting, because you really just don't find those kind of people in science, or at least in meteorology. I haven't. Yeah. I had one friend back at OU who grew up deer hunting and still like to talk about it and do it. But otherwise I just haven't met too many people that are into it. So when I first told people at UW about that, I was like, I don't know how they're going to see me, but everyone was super cool. They were like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's a pretty popular thing up here. And so, yeah, that was awesome.
Cool. All right, so I brought you on today because I want to talk a little bit about weather patterns and how they affect deer movement and stuff like that. Well, let's start off with that. So, how do weather patterns affect deer movement?
Well, I want to start off by saying that I don't claim to be an expert on deer. I have a piece of paper now that says I'm a semi-expert on the weather. But as far as what I think, how I think the weather affects deer, it's just from personal observation and research and things like that. So, you can take my opinion on these things as far as you think it will go. But, I do spend a lot of time thinking about this, because these are two of my passions, weather and deer hunting. So I spend a lot of time putting in the research and trying to figure these things out, especially now that I'm running that website and trying to give people this information. But there's a lot of talking points with this. I mean, cold fronts are probably the biggest talking points that I always have, because big temperature drops once you get into the main part of fall. The deer have their heavy winter coats on, and so if it's really warm out, they're not going to be all that interested in running around when it's 60 something degrees outside. Imagine putting on like your heaviest coat that you have in your closet. If it's 65 degrees outside, you don't want to go running around all day, because you're going to be tired and sweaty and burning all your energy.
Right.
So, and also cold fronts, we know that cold fronts drive deer to feed, because when the temperatures go down, I don't really know why, but to my understanding, it just triggers a feeding instinct in them. And so that's one of the other big things too. So, I focus a lot on cold fronts. And then if you're hunting in sort of deep winter, once you get into the late season, warm-ups after long periods of extreme cold can be good too. And I don't think you need too much of an explanation to understand that, because it's just like, well, it's been super cold. They don't want to move very far because it's super cold. It's kind of the opposite thing,
Right.
they're hunkered down, they're freezing cold, and then when it warms up, they like to get out and stretch their legs and move around. And so, and like up in this part of the country, warm is a relative word. It doesn't necessarily get all that warm, but
goes from 10 to 20.
yeah. Let's say you have a week or two of like, single digits to teens, and you get up into the 30s or something like that, 30s or 40s, and that can also, lead to an increase in deer movement as well. But moving away from just cold fronts, a lot of people like to talk about pressure, and that is I can rant about that for a little bit, so I'm going to wait to talk about that. But precipitation, that can have, from my observation, can have, I think from a lot of people's observations, the main thing with all of this is that different aspects of the weather are going to affect the deer's senses. And that's, when it comes to looking at the weather, you want to think about what the deer is going to be feeling, seeing, hearing, smelling in those kind of conditions. And I think one of the most important things is what they're smelling, how well they can smell. But anything with the weather is going to affect one of those things. And if any one of those things is compromised, they're going to be less comfortable. So if it's raining, rain's noisy, they can't hear as well. They're going to be less comfortable with that. If it's super windy, scent is getting dispersed all over the place. It's not as concentrated. It's all kinds of different smells are coming from all different directions. So that's going to compromise their ability to smell things. And that also is, obviously, wind is very noisy. So again, with high winds, you're compromising two of their senses, which is, in my experience, windy days haven't been that good for me. Although I've seen videos of people's hunts where, they can have success on windy days.
Oh yeah.
And none of these things are like absolute truths, obviously.
Well, it's all in relation to where you live too. So like,
yes,
I mean, you're talking about, okay, you and I were just talking about South Dakota. It's windy there all the freaking time.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
and it is in Oklahoma too.
Yeah. So, if the deer are used to a lot of windy days, wind's not really going to be much of a factor. You just got to know where to look when it's on those windier days. They're still going to be doing their deer things. They're just going to be where the breaks are, where the wind breaks are, and so on and so forth. And I think the same thing goes for inclement weather. So you kind of said it, there's times where I've actually killed 2 big bucks during nor'easters in back east in New York. We're talking gale force winds, 60-mile-an-hour winds, and I actually sat from sun up to sundown the night, and I killed this buck in the very last light. And the next day, my abs were so sore because the tree was swaying me back and forth like this, and I was, having to use my stomach muscles to stabilize myself the whole time up in this tree. I mean, people thought I was crazy for even getting in a tree with that kind of weather, but I just knew that wind was going to be blowing those couple of doe that were coming in to eat. Scent all over the place, and it was going to make some of these bucks get crazy enough to go, because it was like right at that cusp, right where those are just about to start coming in. So, it all depends. It all depends.
It does. There's a million factors. The most recent forecast discussion that I put out last night, I mentioned, like, now that we're getting into the rut up here in the north, and coming into it pretty soon elsewhere, if not already in it,
Mhm.
you know, a lot of these things are still important, but you shouldn't like say it's going to be, a little bit warmer than you would like it to be, but you're
Mhm.
in, but you know, I wouldn't weigh that as heavily as if it were like, let's say mid-October, early October, and you're trying to get
Right.
out there. Because I mean, like you said, bucks go crazy during the rut.
Mhm.
You can go back and think about when you were, you know, 16, 17 years old and starting to get after girls. Like
Right.
you're, you know, you're just hormones and whatever else are going to push you to, maybe do things that aren't so smart,
Right.
just so you can hang out with girls,
Yeah.
and that's just it's a primal thing, and animals haven't evolved past the ability to ignore those impulses. So so it's that's something you got to think about. Like if there's a hot doe in the area, it doesn't matter what the temperature or what the wind is or whatever. Like he's going to get after that doe if he has the opportunity.
Right.
So it when a lot of these things, I don't want to say they go out the window during the rut because
They
um,
don't, because it does. Like, you got to think of it from a doe standpoint. So there's more does up and feeding, like you said, during cold front or whatever. So there's more does moving because they're going to try to stay on their normal pattern.
yeah,
That just means there's going to be more bucks coming in there to bother them.
yeah,
So it doesn't really go out the window. I agree with you,
yeah,
but it's not as much as an absolute as it is, like you said, during the early season.
right, yeah, um, yeah. So, um, but another thing, if we go back to the precipitation thing for a second, so like after it rains for a day or two, if you go out on those next couple days, um, there's probably going to be a lot of moisture in the air if it was a
Mm-hmm.
good soaking rain. Um, and if it's a little bit warmer, if it's not freezing cold, um, the more moisture is in the air, the better your scent is carried.
Mm-hmm.
So deer are going to be able to smell you better when there's more moisture, especially if it's a little bit warmer. Just because water molecules can better attach to your scent molecules and carry them off.
Right.
And so, that's it's nice to go out on days after it's just rain because the leaves are soft. You can move real quietly, but at the same time, you're kind of at the deer's advantage in that situation if it's very humid outside because they can smell you really easily in that scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also as I'm kind of bouncing around different weather factors here, but as you go farther into the fall, as it gets a little bit colder, the food starts to change. Things become Food sources become less palatable as they start to die off. Um, and so as it starts to get colder, they're going to be changing food sources, and so paying attention to how long it's been cold for, or looking ahead maybe out to you know well, yeah, mainly just paying attention to how long it's been cold for. If you know what food sources the deer are hitting and how they change, throughout the fall, and how they like to eat those certain things throughout the fall, that's something to pay attention to too. Um, and you know when I think in we plan to have probably a little bit of a lengthy discussion on this here in a little bit, but going back to just talking wind direction, like um, that has a major effect on how deer bed. And we all know that they travel certain ways with the wind, but it also affects how they bed, especially in hill country. Um, they're gonna most of the time mature bucks are gonna bed where they can see out ahead of them, with the wind to their back.
Right.
And so in hill country, that's going to be like on a ridge where he's got the wind blowing over the top of his head, and he can see out into the bottom or whatever it is, or even if it's in like marsh terrain or something like that. If he can find a spot where he can see out, even just 100 yards or so, with the wind coming behind his back, he can see anything that's coming towards him, and he can smell anything that's coming from behind him. And so, that's the main thing to pay attention to, other than how your scent's going to be carried when it comes to wind direction, is you got to think about how deer are going to bed in relation to that. And I don't think that's a mystery. I think a lot of people know that, but
Right. But you'd be surprised. So out here in the West, I don't think guys, if that little bit of information right there already, like if it's a really windy day and deer are going to be bedded, it behooves you not to look directly into the wind. When you're glassing, you should be looking straight into the wind, because you're looking at all the wind breaks. You're looking at all the places that they're going to want to bed. They got some protection from the wind, and their backside is being covered by the wind at the same time.
Yep.
And now, based on how fast the wind is going, will sometimes delineate, or not really delineate, but necessarily like describe where they're going to be, so to speak. Yeah. Because when it's really fast, they're not going to be way up at the top, because you get a lot more wind that crosses over and speeds up going downhill, as opposed to coming over the top and swirling back.
Right.
And so it's understanding these things that actually help you find where deer are at.
Yeah, definitely.
So it made, like, weather, wind, barometer, all this stuff that we're talking about and we're touching on doesn't necessarily mean if hey, I'm not going to go hunt that day because it's not really a great day to hunt because of this and that. But it also gives you the tools to know where to look for these things. So now, if you're stand hunting and you have several different stands, this is a good stand for me to go hunt, and I'm not just basing it off of wind or whatever, but there's a lot of factors to help you choose where you're going to hunt, how you're going to hunt it, in relationship to weather and wind. I mean, I schedule all my hunts. Obviously, I can't schedule them on weather because weather's unpredictable. But I schedule all my hunts, let's say, because I'm on moon phases, and I try to look for those weather patterns or rainfall patterns or whatever that are historic. And I look at that stuff because I know that certain types of weather, certain moons, and certain times a year is going to up my chances of success.
Yeah.
So,
I haven't. I need to do more research about the whole moon phase thing, because I've heard guys say that that's the got to pay attention to the moon, and there's other guys that say well, it's not that big a deal. And I know for a fact that where the rut falls depends on the length of the time of day.
Yep.
And that's consistent every year. There's no change in that. And the deer do not care what the moon looks like. They're going to start breeding, depending on their body's, internal clock.
The rut doesn't change. It's the activity.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or when the activity happens, I should say.
And I really don't know a whole lot about the moon phase thing. I should probably do more research on it, because that's something I never look at when I go hunting.
Well, a real quick breakdown of it. This is a quick rule of thumb. So it's about the rising and falling of the moon more than so much Well, that's not a completely true statement. I'm trying to simplify it here. There's kind of no way to simplify it.
I've heard
If you
the
can
overhead.
imagine, yeah,
I've heard the
overhead.
overhead underfoot thing.
Yeah. So deer are going to have a desire or a need to feed, excuse me, an hour to 2 hours before the moon is completely overhead or completely underfoot.
Hmm.
So that increases activity because there's a feeding thing. Now, in relationship being full moon or half moon, no moon, blah blah blah, that kind of helps with, and that I think it goes more hand in hand with weather than anything. Because if it's super cold, it doesn't matter. If it's
Yeah.
cold, it doesn't matter. But when you're dealing with warmer weather, if you have full moon, you're going to see a lot more nocturnal movement
That makes sense.
because they can see better when there's a full moon.
Yeah.
And it's cooler at night, so they're going to move. So I see that a lot here. Like I live in Arizona, and like some of these early rifle hunts, especially the early bow season. If there's a full moon, you're not going to see a whole lot of activity during the day because it's 115 degrees here. So they'd rather get up and do most of their activity at night.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
That being said, they do have to get up at some point during the day to do some business, whatever, eat, pee, shit, whatever, drink, but it's going to be limited.
Yeah.
So I took you off top there for a second, but so let's talk a little bit. Like, what are some advantages to knowing, to understanding weather and knowing how they use weather? What are some things that you can do to kind of like use those to your advantage, and like the how, what, when, and why, and how type scenario of.
Well, I think as a meteorologist, the biggest benefit for me is knowing where to get all this information and also how to interpret it. Like as far as weather information goes, when I'm on forums and things like that, that's people's, other than just how weather affects deer, that's probably the other biggest topic when they're talking about weather is where do I find, how to see a trend in pressure, or where do I find a surface map that shows this, this parameter.
Right.
So it's definitely an advantage for me to know where to get all that information and how to use it. But I've been trying to make that more readily available to people through my website. Using and reading weather models and interpreting weather models is a bit of a touchy subject in meteorology because some people abuse it, and there's a reason that there's tons of different models is because no one model tells you exactly how things are going to work out.
Right.
If you've ever seen hurricane forecast tracks, when those things are several days out, they don't have any idea where those things are going. You've seen the spaghetti plots; they diverge like crazy.
Yeah.
So, on my website, I always, the forecasts I give are a big picture. I'm never like, here's the exact temperature and wind speed and direction it's going to be in Madison, Wisconsin. I would be there for weeks trying to make a forecast like that for everywhere in the country. So it's impossible as a one-man show, and really it's impossible as a team. A lot of your point forecasts where, if you get on like the Weather Service or whatever and you see a point forecast for Sand Springs, Oklahoma or Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it tells you the exact information for that point location, it's often automated. They'll have a weather model that, whatever weather model they think is good, or they'll take a spread of weather models and plug them in for those locations. And that's how you get that point information. So there's hardly ever actual living forecaster giving forecasts for specific locations like that, because it's just not reasonable to do that.
Right.
But if you know how to use these things properly and all the ins and outs and whatnot, I can get on these model sites and I can look at forecasts for any parameter you could possibly imagine when it comes to the weather. Pressure, temperature, wind, all that good stuff. And these, there's just not a lot of good apps and websites and things that show exactly what a deer hunter wants to see. And I've tried to make my website and do my forecast discussions in a way that's, it takes these models and weather information that's coming out, and also, my knowledge as a meteorologist, and actually honing that in to talk about it in the perspective of a deer hunter. And it seems to be working pretty well. I mean, I've gotten some good feedback, and people seem to really like it. But it's I would say that's the biggest advantage for me. Is just for me, I know where to get all this information. I know how to use it, and it's not necessarily the easiest thing to be able to read and understand without an education on it.
Right.
And that was the whole motivation for me behind this website, was to take that and get away from the science perspective and get into the deer hunter's perspective that doesn't care about all the nitty-gritty details of weather forecasting and science, and break it down that way.
Okay. Well, let's I don't know, can you dumb it down, or so to speak? Can you simplify it, make it kind of simple, stupid? Give us like several rules of thumb. Like if you see this type of, and again, it's going to be relative to where you live too. Again, but is there some like, when you see this, your ass is getting out there and getting in the tree stand, or you're going out there to hunt because that's weather you're looking for.
Yeah. For me, I mean, it's cold fronts. I hunt cold fronts, and that's why I named my website Hunt the Front, because I really believe you should be hunting cold fronts. But I look for days that have not calm wind, but not strong wind, because again, it's like a happy medium thing. You don't want their sending abilities compromised, but you don't want them to have like a huge advantage over you.
Right. I like 10 miles an hour.
Yeah. I mean, 10 to 15 miles an hour, that's about where I like to be too. And I like to see 10 to 15 degree temperature drops. And then other than that, I've sat out in the rain for hours, and sometimes I'll see deer movement, and a lot of times in my experience hunting in Oklahoma and up here, I've sat in the rain up here too. I just don't see much when it rains. And that could possibly be from some factors we talked about earlier. Maybe I was just unlucky on those days. I don't know, but
probably a little bit of everything. See, yeah. I like hunting the rain.
Yeah,
and I think it comes down to knowing where to hunt.
That's
with the type of weather. You can't just go get in, your field edge stand. If we're talking about whitetail hunting now, you can't just go get in a field edge stand and during a rainstorm and hope that deer are going to be out there feeding.
Right. Yeah.
Chances are there probably won't be. I mean, depending on how much rain we're talking about. If it's light drizzle, go ahead, sit that stand, But look for those food sources that have, some cover, that have some windbreaks, and have some, rain cover, good canopy, stuff like that. If we're talking about whitetail hunting, mass producing trees or whatever, that's probably where they're going to be feeding. They're not going to be out in, Uncle Joe's cornfield.
Yeah.
So, and if you want to take that, look at the West, I feel like the rain is even less a factor. I think, especially like on elk or mule deer, even antelope, because antelope, they're always out and exposed. They don't really get to be under trees, so it's a matter of kind of observing And now if this is a destination hunt and you've never been there before, you don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
Um, but you can definitely find out behavioral stuff from a biologist that works that area. Giving them a call, say, hey, I'm going to be there next week, and it looks like we might have some heavy rains and stuff like that. What do the deer typically do in that area? During heavy rains, do they tend to find bedding in certain areas and so on and so forth, and just being smart about things,
Yeah.
because let's face it, we only have X amount of days to hunt,
hmm
and you're not going to kill them from the damn couch.
Nope.
So
Yeah, I definitely live by that philosophy too.
yeah,
Even though I don't particularly like to hunt in the rain, and that's mainly because I'm lacking a lot of rain hunting gear. I need to fix that.
yeah,
But I totally believe in you don't kill them from the couch. And like I said, I've already been out hunting in the rain twice here in Wisconsin, and
yeah,
I got soaked, but I was out there.
yeah. No, yeah, it's going to be miserable. You're going to be freezing your ass off, and it's not going to be a good sit, but it can be.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can,
I mean, it can all turn around real quick for
yeah,
sure.
or just then there's other things too. Like you need not just change where you're hunting, change your tactics. You might be using a ground blind at this point. Like I've done. It's always about being adaptable,
hmm
and adapting to the situation. And like me having you on today to share a little insight onto weather and how deer. It's not for people to say, oh, okay, I'm not going to go hunting that day because the moon's not great, the weather doesn't look awesome.
Yeah, no,
I'm just
definitely.
not going to go hunting.
Yeah,
You
and
got
there's I
it,
I I don't think you should be that way either. But I see a lot of people that that kind of handle it that way. Oh, I don't have
yeah,
the perfect conditions today, so I'm not going. You definitely,
yeah.
you
It's
know,
not worth going. No, there's no such thing as not worth going, because the more time you spend in the field, there's no bigger deciding factor in hunting success than time spent.
yeah, no, definitely.
Simple
Yeah,
as
I
that.
mean, if I didn't have responsibilities, I would hunt every day. But
Yeah, of course. We
um,
all would.
yeah, but yeah, no, I totally agree. I I talk in my forecasts. I'm like, well, today's probably going to see better activity than tomorrow would, or whatever. But
Hmm.
at the end of the day, you need to take this information home with you and evaluate it yourself and make your own
Right,
decision.
right.
I don't want to be persuading people to not go hunting or go hunting, and if they're smart, I won't.
Yeah.
And hell, most people think meteorologists are idiots anyway. But
Because you guys are never right.
yeah,
Just kidding.
yeah. If you knew how many times a year I hear that sentence.
I know, that's why I said it.
Between that and you're going to school for meteorology, you're gonna get paid to be wrong. Only job you can get paid to be wrong.
Yeah.
If only you knew what goes into it.
Oh, I know. I know.
But
I have a friend of mine that's also in meteorology, and he's been telling me that for years.
yeah,
So we started to talk a little bit about the barometer.
yeah,
Let's talk about the barometer and how that affects movement.
okay. So I talked about this in a recent post on my website, but it, people can think I'm crazy for this opinion. They might think it's really genius. Who knows? But I personally don't think the barometer has anything to do with how deer behave. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
and the reason being is because I don't think they have any way of knowing what the pressure is doing.
Okay.
Um, other than, like some, older people, they can feel pressure changes in their joints or whatever, you know, um, things like that. Other than that, do we as people have any way of going outside and saying, oh, it's high pressure today, or oh, it's low pressure today? Other than me as a meteorologist, I can walk outside and say, oh, there's no clouds, there's high pressure today.
Yeah.
But in general, you don't have any organs or sensory abilities that allow you to perceive that. And the anatomic makeup of a deer is very similar to ours, with the exception of they don't have a gallbladder and they have a 4-chambered stomach. Other than those two things, they pretty much have the same organs that we do.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, there's just no way that they can perceive that there's pressure changes. Now, people have always associated high pressure with good deer hunting. And to me, the reason for that is because cold fronts are 99.9% of the time associated with rising pressure.
Right.
And that's because as a cold front moves through, you have cold air behind it that's sinking down to the ground. And as that cold air sinks down to the ground, you get a buildup of air at the surface, which creates high pressure. And, after a cold front moves through, you'll have pressure rising for 2 or 3 days afterwards. And so, to me, it makes more sense that the cold front has the effect on the deer movement, because we've already talked about why that is. They feel that. They feel that temperature change. It drives them to do, things during the day, get out and move around. But I just don't see any way that they can possibly tell whether or not the pressure is going up and down. And so it makes more sense. It makes more sense to me that if you're going to look at the weather to plan your hunt, I would be much, much, much more focused on whether or not you're going to have big temperature changes than whether or not you're going to have, 1,030 millibar high pressure for when you're going out.
Right. So I look at the barometer, but I look for changes. And this is my my take on it. I feel no matter what, if there is a substantial, I don't want to say drastic, but a substantial change from either hot to cold or cold to hot or dry to wet, wet to dry, it's going to spark movement.
Yeah.
I look for changes. If the weather's changing tomorrow, the fact that the weather, if it's going to go from good to bad, I know those deer are going to be up. And I don't know what it is, 6th sense, whatever it is that they got, if they got a special little pituitary gland that senses pressure or whatever the hell it is. I don't know. But I know from experience that a significant change from low to high, high to low, like I said, cold to hot, hot to cold, wet to dry, dry to wet, there's going to be a change in and the way I always do it is if it's going to go from good to bad, hunt it right before it turns bad. And if it's going to go from bad to good, as soon as it turns good, hunt it.
Yeah. Well, and I totally agree with you that it's all about big changes in the weather. I totally agree with that. But the change in pressure from high to low, or whatever it does,
mm-hmm.
it's an indirect result of a weather change.
Right.
And so, people, if you look at the, if you're, and I tell people this when I've brought this up, you don't have to get behind my opinion and jump on that bandwagon. But if you're going to look at the pressure for your deer hunts, make it something that is like the bottom of your list for checking things off. That would be my advice.
Right.
Because I really think that, the temperature changes, what the wind is like, whether or not it's raining or snowing or whatever, all that stuff is going to be much more important than whether or not the temperature or the pressure is going up and down.
Right. I say the thing about the pressure going up and down is really a byproduct of the weather changing.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
That's why I look at it, because it's easier to read than necessarily, or I think a lot of people put weight on it because it's just an easier scale to understand that it's easier to watch change.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. That's something I actually hadn't thought about. That's a great point, that you can look at pressure and, assume that, well, there's some kind of weather change going on from the pressure changing.
Right.
If you don't want to spend a lot of time looking at the weather, then that's a great point. You can look at, if there's a big pressure rise, well, then something probably happened. But
right,
that's a good point.
Yeah. So I think that's where the barometer comes in. It becomes a useful tool. That you don't have if you don't have the knowledge to be able to read all these charts or whatever, and look at all the different pieces of the puzzle that make up weather, it's just kind of a simple, not necessarily simple, stupid, but just kind of a little more easier Geiger meter, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah. No. Definitely.
What's happening. So.
Yeah, and the reason I came to this conclusion and kind of ran about it sometimes is because I watch hunting videos or listen to hunters talk about it, and they're always like, "We had a cold front move through last night, and we have rising pressure today."
Yeah.
And it's like, well, of course you do. Those two things are not separate from each other.
Yeah, they go hand in hand.
Exactly.
For sure. But everybody doesn't understand that. People don't know that.
Yeah, I know, and that's kind of I've kind of been trying to spread that understanding on my website and say, hey, yes, you can look at the pressure as a good diagnostic for whether or not there's weather changes, but I don't think you should look at it individually and say, okay, if I have high pressure today, that means good deer movement. You need to have other factors in there.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about wind.
Okay.
And relationship to terrain, what it does around, moving around rocks, moving around ridges, we could probably spend an hour on just talking, not more than just on this, but
yeah, for sure.
Let's try to kind of give some basics, talk about stand placement, and then I've done quite a bit of research on it myself, and hopefully some of the stuff that you're going to talk about, I'll be able to kind of talk about it in from a different standpoint for a spot and stalk hunter as opposed to a stand hunter.
Yeah. So I did a short video on this a few days ago, but just basically talking about turbulence and how different terrain features an object affect the wind and things like that. And the main thing you need to understand is how the wind is, well, in my opinion, the main thing you need to understand is how the wind is going to swirl depending on what terrain features you're around, and how much it's going to swirl or what direction it's going to swirl. And we can get into some examples of this. Let's say you're hunting in hill country. If you hunt a ridge top, you don't want to be on the down. I mean, you can hunt the downwind side of a ridge because that's where deer are going to be. Obviously, you want to be over there, but you need to think about it intelligently to where you can set up in the best way possible to avoid how the wind is going to swirl. Because when you set up on the downwind side of a ridge, it's going to be nothing but swirling because you have air moving quickly over the top. And then when it comes over the backside of the ridge, that ridge is blocking the wind on the other side of it. And so you get a pinwheel effect. You have the air going quickly over the top, going slower below it. And so you get an overturning motion.
Right. It starts spinning off the top, like swirling.
Exactly. Yeah. And,
and so when it does it, right, when it comes over the top of the ridge, it goes out, depending on the speed, goes out a certain way and then rolls back and comes back to the.
Yep, exactly. It rolls back, and then, in the case of a ridge top or something, oftentimes it'll travel, back up the face of the downwind side of the ridge, and probably, catch you sitting in your stand, and then take your scent out and keep swirling down back into the ridge and up and down back into the the draw a little bit farther, and just, everything in a square half mile is going to know you're sitting there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it in a really windy scenario, I don't know how effective sitting on the downwind side of a ridge is going to be, because the deer are certainly at an advantage to you.
Right.
They're at a much better advantage than you are. But, let's say.
I just want to put a little marker right there. I'm going to come back to that
Okay.
very thing you just said, but from a spot and stalk standpoint. After you're done finishing your thought. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, that's all right. I was actually about to kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent, so you can go ahead.
Okay. So the very difference about this scenario, okay, so now we're talking about sitting in a tree stand.
Yeah, definitely.
You're there. The wind's passing over you, might be passing over you several times and just keeps collecting, and that wind is just swirling there. Now, from a spot and stalk situation, say you got a deer bedded on the top of this ridge and the wind is going over the top. It's basically hitting him in the back and he's looking straight down the ridge.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on how fast the wind is going, that deer, even though you come right over the top of him, may not be able to smell you for 30 seconds, a minute, whatever. I do it all the time. It's cheating the wind. I wish I could draw. I mean, I could draw a diagram, but not everybody's going to be able to see this, unfortunately. But basically, I'm going to try to paint the picture. So you have a deer bedded, let's say, 40 yards down from the top of a ridge.
Okay.
And your approach is from the back side of the ridge to come over the top to make a shot at him. One, you don't come direct. Okay, direct line, no. You come from an angle,
mm-hmm.
Okay, until you get close to him. Then you still want to be on an angle from him, not be directly above him. Because if the wind's moving fast enough, it's going to take your scent out before it circles back and comes back to the mountain for him to smell you. Yeah. And if you're coming from an angle, if the wind is strong enough, your cone isn't going to be as wide. It's going to be a lot more narrow.
Yeah.
The faster the wind, the more narrow your cone is.
Mm-hmm.
Before it starts hitting trees and then it starts spreading and whatever. So, and I've done this several times. So, okay, last year in Utah, I had no other way of getting to this buck, and I only got 6 days to hunt. So I'm going to take every stalk I possibly can. And since I'm not hunting a specific deer, I'm looking, if I blow this buck out, there's other deer for me to go hunt.
Mm-hmm.
So now if you're hunting a very specific deer and you're, got a lot of time, you probably don't want to do what I'm going to tell you to do. I approach the top of the ridge at a severe angle so that when I get to that point that I should be able to see him, I'll be, let's say, 20 yards to his left or to his right and be able to see him down 40 yards on an angle, So my wind, I'm cheating the wind. My wind is not going to him. And now if I sit at the top of that ridge long enough, he's eventually going to catch my wind.
Yeah.
It's going to keep swirling and it's going to keep spreading and coming back towards him, barreling back towards him. But in that scenario, if I get there and if I can make a shot on him within a couple minutes, that's very doable. So in Utah last year, very same scenario, wind was barreling at him, and I came over and I peeked and I couldn't see him from the 20 yards over. So I actually had to go back and come right over the top of him, and I came right over the top of him, got the full draw, and I was about to send the shot, and that's when he caught I could see him catch my wind, and he stood up and he turned and he faced me. And I missed because of the wind, because I never settled my pin. I was kind of shaking. It was pretty windy, but
yeah,
I missed the shot, but I still got the shot opportunity.
Yeah,
and it would have been a good shot. So people get really afraid of the wind, but if you kind of pay attention and really watch what wind does and how it interacts with terrain and stuff like that, you could push it a lot more than you think you can.
Oh yeah,
And again, I'm known for pushing the shit out of things. Plus, I'm a stickler for scent control, so it usually gives me a few more seconds because my wind doesn't. It's not as predominant. There's no way of effectively eliminating completely, but so I just want to throw that in there.
No, yeah,
stand hunting is a completely different story. You can't do that.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
That's really cool. I've never done that type of hunting. I hope to eventually, but I need to get to a spot where I'm making more than graduate student money.
Yep.
But yeah, that's really cool. I could definitely see how that would work because if you have a strong true wind, then like you said, your scent's going to get carried out and away before it actually encounters him and before it, comes back. So that's really cool. But yeah, you're right. It's really just, you can find videos all over YouTube of turbulence visualized around different objects, and you can Google something, or you can YouTube what's called the Reynolds number, and you'll find tons of videos showing you, how different flow speeds and different objects affect how the wind behaves and how fluids behave. And I think looking at that kind of stuff really would do a service to a hunter, any kind of hunter, whether you're whether you're in the mountains or the desert or the woods up where I'm at, whatever. Understanding that stuff is only going to do you a service. But what I always do is, you're not going to know exactly what your wind is going to do when you go out somewhere. You're not going to know a piece of property well enough and be able to study every little thing on that piece of property well enough to know exactly what your wind is going to do. So what I always do up here in Wisconsin is they have a lot of what's called milkweed. And it's basically these little pods, and with all these seeds in them, and all these seeds have little, like really, really lightweight hairs attached to them.
Right.
And I'll take a couple of those milkweed pods into the woods with me. And when I'm walking into my spot, I'm always throwing out some of those milkweed pods, watching what the wind does, making sure my wind is going the direction I think it is. And I'll keep doing that as I get to where I think I'm going to set up. And if I get to my spot and I throw out those milkweed pods and it looks like, the wind's not going to do what I think it was going to do, then I'll relocate. And obviously you can't do this all evening. Or all morning. You've got to figure out where you're going to go and set up eventually. But,
right.
That's that. If you do one thing with the wind, it should always be checking it as you're going into your spot and as you're moving around, whether you've just got one of those little like powder indicator things, or you've got milkweed or whatever little lightweight thing you can figure out to throw around. You should always be checking your wind. And trying to understand, how different objects and terrain affect it. But yeah, so that's kind of how I approach it.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I think we might come back and do another podcast here in the future and talk just specifically about wind and thermals and stuff like that. So, just because I can feel this is something that a rabbit hole we might go down if I keep asking the questions that I have. And I like to keep my podcast around about an hour or so. Not that if they go over, it's okay. It doesn't matter to me. But I think it would be a good standalone podcast, just understanding the wind and thermals. And
it probably would be.
And something that we could really plan for. And we might do that as a video podcast, and we can use some props and have some visual stuff, and we can put that on my YouTube as opposed to putting it this way.
Yeah, I've got some good videos I can already think of for thermals and for just turbulence and all that stuff. So that would definitely be cool.
Sweet. Cool. Well, let's plan for that. So before I let you go, I want to ask you to share a story with me. Maybe something that is weather related, a hunting story where it doesn't even have to be a successful hunt or whatever, but something that you kind of figured out about weather, or how you figured out about the cold front being the time for you to go or whatever. Just a good hunting story if you got one.
With the weather. I know you told me we'd tell a hunting story, so I prepared for a little bit something a little bit different. But
go ahead, share that one with us. Don't mean it. I don't want to throw you off. Yeah, don't make you. Don't fry your brain thinking about which one. Just tell the one that comes to mind.
Yeah. Well, I haven't really had any, light bulbs sitting in the woods as far as the weather goes. I mean, other than just, when I was younger, I figured out that you definitely need to pay more attention to where your wind is going and how your scent's being carried.
Right.
That's probably one of the biggest lessons I learned as far as the weather goes growing up, is that you actually do need to pay attention to what the wind is doing. When I was younger, me and my grandpa, I'm sure he had some method to it, but when I was really young, he didn't do a lot of the explainings of the ins and outs of the details about how you decide where you're going to hunt. We would just go hunt.
Right.
And, so, I didn't pay attention to those things when I first started going out on my own. But no, I would say probably one of the most impactful hunting moments for me was actually the last deer I killed with a rifle. And this was, I think I was 14 or 15 last time I shot a deer with a rifle. And I was actually chasing a pretty big buck last year with my rifle. And the dang neighbor killed him the last weekend that I was up there, which blew my mind because the property I hunt on back in Oklahoma is like 2,000 acres. But somehow he was moving enough during that period of the season that the neighbor caught up with him. But that's hunting. But anyway, so whenever this was, 14 or 15 years old, it was opening morning of rifle season in Oklahoma, which is I think it's either the third. I think it's the third end of the third week of November usually. And me, my little brother, and my grandpa are all in this tower box blind, and a buck comes running out at what was barely even gray light. I mean, we could barely tell that he was even there, and he was like 50 yards away. I mean, it's barely legal shooting light. And my grandpa said, "Hey, that's a pretty good deer." And me being, he gave me the sort of priority, like, we see a good deer, I get the opportunity to shoot it first because I was the older kid, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the last deer I had shot before that was a 9-point buck, and I wanted something with more antlers.
Yeah.
And,
greedy.
Yeah. So when Grandpa said he saw this buck, I said, "Well, how many points does he have?" And I love listening to Grandpa tell this story because he always thought it was hilarious. But I asked Grandpa, I said, "How many points does he have?" And Grandpa was like, "Well, I don't know how many points he has, but he's a good deer." And I said, "Well, I don't know. I mean, I could see him just barely, but I didn't know for sure." And so I was like, "Well, Cole, I can't make a decision. So if you want to shoot him, shoot him." And so my brother this was going to be my brother's first deer. So he just hangs a gun out the window and blasts it. He didn't care.
Right.
And so, so he shoots this deer, and we kind of watched where it went, had an idea of where it went. But like I said, I mean, it's early in the morning. So, you know, me and we were going to sit there for several more hours to see if I could get something. And I think about 9 or 9:30, my grandpa had something he had to go do for a little bit. So he snuck out of the stand and left me and my brother sitting up there. And it wasn't, I think it was like 30 or 45 minutes after he got out of the stand, another buck came out. And um, I decided he was a pretty good deer, so I decided to shoot him. And I made a good shot, but my grandpa could hear the shot from where he was at down the road. And so, you know, a few minutes after I shot, he comes down the road to where the stand was. And Grandpa was really excited because my brother and I were both going to have bucks down the opening morning of rifle season. So he's super excited. He gets out of the truck and he's like, let's go find him, you know, and it's only been 10, 15 minutes since I shot this deer. And, you know, but we go running in after my deer and we find it, and it's not dead. It's bedded down. I mean, it's hit good. There's blood everywhere. And it probably wasn't going to be that long before he expired, but I mean, it's a bloody mess. And we get back there and, he tries to get up and run off, and my grandpa grabs my rifle from me and shoots it again. And I mean, point blank range.
Oh,
and yeah. And, you know, I was kind of like, whoa, because I mean, the deer I had killed before this, you know, I shot them from 130, 140 yards away, and they died off in the woods, and I got to them and they were dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, and same thing with my bow kills, you know, it's been, you know, sometimes you have to put another arrow in a deer, but it's quiet. It's, you know, there's not the big kaboom with the gun. There was just something about that when I was 14 years old and I saw this deer, you know, struggling to try to get up and run off, and Grandpa, you know, putting another round in me with my rifle. It was just very graphic for me.
Right.
It's kind of like, oh my gosh, we just had to like murder this thing, you know.
Yeah.
And so, you know, after that, you know, the deer died shortly after that second shot, but I was kind of in shock. And so, you know, I mean, I'm still excited, but I mean, I get over to my deer and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like this was not nearly as fun as the last few deer that I've killed, just because what I had to just watch. And
right.
So, you know, that for me was one of the most, definitely one of the most impactful things that ever happened to me deer hunting. It really kind of pushed me, it kind of pushed me away from rifle hunting as much. I mean, I still go out with a gun, but that was the last time I shot something with a gun, and that was 14 years old.
Yeah.
And like I said, had I caught up with that buck last year that the neighbor killed, I would have shot him with a gun. But I just never got an opportunity. But, you know, I've been much less passionate of a rifle hunter since then. And that really built an immense respect for the animal within me. You know, because before that, I really didn't see deer as anything but like something to go chase for fun. And after that, I had much more respect for what I was doing and the animal itself. And you know, any deer that I have killed or my brother has killed since then, there's always a very respectful treatment of the carcass and the whole process. And anytime we take pictures, you know, I don't like to leave them all bloody and messy and share that all over the internet. We always try to clean them up and get them looking just out of respect when we take the picture and stuff like that. And so, you know, that really I think, defined me as a hunter since then, because now I don't go into the woods just ready to kill something. I definitely get excited to kill something still. I'm obviously a passionate deer hunter still, but it's just, I'm not going to shoot anything I see. I've got to be really sold if I'm going to kill something. And it's a very respectful process for me now. It's not just going out and killing something. But to go back to the main reason I brought up the fact that my brother shot that deer early in the morning, other than it making my grandpa excited, was because that was my little brother's first buck that I passed up, and we couldn't tell what he was in the early morning light. And we walk over this deer, and it's 145-inch 10-point buck.
I knew you were going to go to that.
This is my brother's
story going that way.
Yeah, this is my brother's first buck, and my first buck was, I thought my first buck for a first buck was pretty decent. He was like a little 5-point, kind of. I think he was a 3-year-old because he had a huge body, but he only had 5 antlers. He was a 3x2, but a lot of people's first bucks are like spikes or forks, and so I was pretty proud of that as a first buck. And my brother comes out here and shoots 140-inch 10-point for his first buck, and I was just like, oh my god. Nice. And that was another teaching point that day: is if Grandpa says it's a good buck, it's a good buck.
Nice. So his ended up being bigger than yours, huh?
So yeah, it was. The deer I shot that day was a pretty good deer. I think he was maybe 130 inches, something like that. But that was a great day. Even with the little bit of a shocking last minute of my buck, it was still a great day. That was one of the most memorable hunts for me, just because it was me, my brother, and Grandpa, and we both killed bucks on the opening morning of rifle season, and it was a great time. That's a great memory of mine.
Cool. Well, awesome, man. Real quick, where can listeners find out about you and your website?
So the website is called huntthefront.blog. If you Google Hunt the Front, it should be the second or third thing that pops up. It's Hunt the Front weather forecast for deer hunting. And I put forecasts out every Monday. Sometimes they come out Monday morning, sometimes they're Monday evening. Just depends on what my schedule's like. But and then I kind of have I do other things at random. Like I made a video recently on how air takes your scent stream and turbulence and all that stuff, and that just was I really sat on like a Wednesday or something, nothing specific. So
cool.
Yeah, just I'm kind of I started the website back in September, and just kind of been taking people's feedback and developing it as I go. And so it may not be in tip top shape, but I think it I made some recent updates to it a couple weeks ago that I really like the way it looks and how it how it runs now. So yeah, come check out the site. It's in essence, I give a broad overview of the week's weather, and I use weather models and meteorological processes to break down the weather in a way that a deer hunter can understand and use. And I don't use any jargon or any fancy science crap that people don't care to listen to. So it's tailored with the deer hunter in mind.
Awesome, man. I want to thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. Like I said, maybe we'll hook back up here in a few weeks and do something just specifically on wind and put something together so people get a better understanding.
Yeah, I would love to. That sounds great.
All right, man. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Appreciate it.
Goodbye.
If you're trying to figure out how to follow the podcast, there's many different ways, but one of the easiest to do is go to interviewswiththehuntingmasters.podbean.com. And this will bring you to the main hosting site. So come to this homepage. You'll see all the episodes available here for you to click on and listen to. And that's from your computer. If to follow it, you just click on these 3 bars below the iPod icon or logo here, and it'll bring you, this will open, and you could click on follow. If you don't already have a Podbean account, that's pretty simple. You just email password type scenario where you can set up a Podbean account to follow. You can also download the Podbean app on your Apple device or your Android device by clicking on either one of these. That will give you the actual Podbean player on your phone or device, rather. It could be iPod, iPad, Android tablet or anything like that. So those are some of the ways that you could follow the show.